He was born to save England, and he nearly destroyed it. Edward VI, son of Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, entered the world in October 1537, a single wail in a silent chamber, followed by the sound of bells across the kingdom. His birth ended years of royal anxiety, political murder, and religious division. A male heir, finally. The future of the Tudor dynasty seemed secure, but beneath the celebrations was a cost no one could ignore. His mother, Jane, died just 12 days after childbirth, and the joy that welcomed him was soaked in blood. His siblings were illegitimized. His mother's rivals had met the axe. His father's church had broken from Rome. The kingdom Edward inherited was one torn in half, by dogma, by ambition, by fear. England in the 1530s was not simply a nation in religious flux. It was a country under siege from within. The Reformation had begun tearing at the old order. Monasteries were dissolved, their lands seized. Latin masses vanished from churches overnight. Men who had once sung the Ave Maria were now burned at the stake for doing so. Others who preached in English were dragged into cells for daring to speak too loudly. The state's position on heresy was not just strict, it was shifting. Loyalty one year was treason the next. And at the center of it all stood Henry VIII, a man who called himself both supreme head of the church and defender of the faith. His rule was law, his whims gospel. He had changed the religion of a kingdom not from theological conviction, but to satisfy his own succession crisis. So when Edward was born, he became more than a prince. He was a symbol, a vessel, the hope of a stable England reborn in flesh. But Henry's obsession with preserving this future would lead to the child's undoing. From the moment Edward opened his eyes, he was surrounded by guards, nurses, and priests. He was rocked not by mothers, but by ministers. He was bathed in scripture, fed on ideology. Henry lavished him with everything a royal child could have, except the chance to be a child at all. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who endured rejection, loss, and disgrace, Edward was revered. Henry believed Edward's soul had to be protected from the contamination of false teaching. He brought in not mere tutors, but theologians, John Check, Richard Cox, Roger Ascham, men who viewed Protestantism not as a doctrine to discuss, but as a fire to wield. Edward's lessons began at dawn and continued into dusk. He learned Greek and Latin, of course, arithmetic, astronomy, logic. But those were decorations. At the core of his education was something far more dangerous: absolute spiritual certainty. By age 6, he could cite passages from Calvin, Zwingli, and Tyndale. By 7, he could describe the theological justification for burning heretics. His tutors taught him that mercy was compromise, and compromise was sin. That kings ruled not by blood, but by divine right, and that God's will was his will, unquestionable, unchangeable, supreme. He had no companions his age, no real friends. His attendants bowed when they approached. Even his laughter, when it came, was cautious, guarded by protocol. Every moment reinforced a single truth: he was chosen. And so, by the time his father died in January 1547, Edward didn't become king. He assumed a role he already believed was his by divine appointment. He was 9. At first, England thought it would be ruled by council. The Duke of Somerset, Edward's uncle, became Lord Protector. Others joined the regency to guide the child through the storm of politics, war, and faith. But Edward didn't wait. Within weeks of the coronation, he began taking notes in council meetings. Not doodles, notes, structured, analytical, interventions. He corrected older men on their theological interpretations. He debated doctrine with bishops. He questioned why certain heretics had not yet been tried, and whether some punishments were too lenient. To his advisors, it was remarkable. To the few who dared to see clearly, it was terrifying. Edward wasn't merely precocious. He was convinced. He had been molded into an intellectual weapon, sharp, articulate, and utterly convinced of his own infallibility. And so began one of the shortest, yet most ideologically extreme reigns in English royal history. At first, his rule looked like reform. Latin services were abolished. Priests were ordered to preach in English. Images of saints were stripped from churches, their faces smashed, their gold scraped away. The Book of Common Prayer, written by Archbishop Cranmer, became mandatory. Worship was standardized. Attendance was enforced. But the spirit behind it was no gentle nudge toward modernity. It was a purge. Edward believed compromise was betrayal. His government, under Somerset, initially tried to balance. Some of the regents still held Catholic sympathies. Some feared civil war, but the king did not. When council members proposed tolerating private Catholic practice among the nobility, Edward reportedly flew into a rage. He shouted them down. When one advisor suggested quiet leniency, the boy hurled his inkwell across the chamber. Edward wasn't just intolerant of resistance. He saw it as treason against God. Behind the scenes, he was already drafting letters to bishops across the country demanding reports on priests who resisted reform. He established a network of informants. Preachers were monitored. Landowners were questioned. Those who clung to Rome were named, shamed, and often arrested. Even his free time reflected this zeal. While other boys played with toy soldiers, Edward read accounts of martyrdom. He annotated stories of torture and execution with precise notes. He asked for drawings of devices used during the Inquisition. Some of those sketches survive, along with his handwritten comments on their effectiveness. His diary reveals no remorse. Only observation. One entry notes the execution of a group of Anabaptists. Edward describes how each was burned and where. He concludes with a brief theological rationale for their fate. There is no emotion, no reflection, no sense that lives have ended, only that justice has been served. His cruelty was not limited to religious dissenters. It extended to servants, courtiers, even family. A page who spoiled documents was forced to kneel in the courtyard while others pelted him with rotten vegetables, at Edward's direction. The king watched and, according to records, took notes on the page's expression. He found humiliation more instructive than punishment. When a maid was caught saying a rosary under her breath, she was dragged from her quarters and flogged. She died 3 days later. Edward's diary entry? Correction proved more permanent than expected. He was 11. By this point, the Regency Council had changed. Somerset was removed, replaced by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. Dudley saw what Somerset didn't, that Edward wasn't a puppet, but a force. So Dudley shifted tactics. Instead of guiding the king, he flattered him. He fed the boy's ego. He showed him plans for expanding Protestant authority. He let Edward believe he was the true architect of England's future. And Edward believed it. He increased surveillance across the realm. Attendance at Protestant services became law. Absence led to interrogation. Children were encouraged to report their parents. Clergy were forced to recite sermons written by the court. Parishioners who knelt at the wrong time were noted. Some were fined. Others were whipped. Edward read every report. He once summoned a village constable to question him personally about a priest who refused to wear the correct robes, not because the priest had preached heresy, but because he knelt too long at communion. To Edward, ceremony was a declaration of loyalty, and loyalty had only one direction: up. By his 12th year, He began revising not only how England prayed, but how it thought. He wrote new rules for school prayer. He banned old religious plays. He closed shrines and called for the melting of relics. Some scholars believe he even drafted the first plans for a national registry of beliefs, a record of every parish's theological compliance. This wasn't reform. It was pre-modern totalitarianism, and it came not from fear, not from reaction, but from the quiet confidence of a child who had never been told no. Edward VI didn't stumble into cruelty. He was taught that it was holy, and so he embraced it, fully, calmly, and without hesitation. Edward's vision of England did not stop at doctrine or prayer. It extended to blood, and no one, not even his own family, was beyond suspicion. Mary Tudor, Edward's older half-sister, was devoutly Catholic. Her faith was unshakable, rooted in old rites and the authority of Rome. Where Edward saw truth in Scripture alone, Mary saw salvation in tradition. That difference marked her, in Edward's eyes, as an existential threat to his kingdom. He began monitoring her closely. Letters between them turned clipped and cold. When she continued to hear Mass in private, Edward didn't send a warning. He sent royal agents. Her chaplains were interrogated. Her servants questioned. Her loyalty doubted. Mary refused to bend. So Edward turned to the law. He began drafting ways to erase her from the line of succession. He called her illegitimate, consulted Protestant legal minds on how to charge her with heresy. One surviving letter contains a full speech he intended her to read before execution, where she would confess her Catholic crimes and beg for mercy before the axe. He was 13. Mary, he wrote, was the serpent of Rome, Christ's enemy, a bastard in denial. He imagined her burning. He dreamed of a reformation sealed with her blood. His hatred wasn't just political, it was deeply personal, fueled by an unshakable belief that her very existence endangered England's soul. Elizabeth, by contrast, was Protestant and marginally safer. But Edward didn't see her as a sister either. He saw her as a tool. Her marriage would serve diplomatic function. Her obedience would reinforce his ideology. Her happiness was not a factor. She was an asset, not family. Even those who had once shown him affection were cast aside. His uncle Thomas Seymour had showered him with gifts and kindness in his early years. But when Seymour was implicated in a plot, whether true or exaggerated, Edward didn't flinch. He authorized the execution, watched it from a palace window, recorded the moment in his journal with the words, "The matter was resolved efficiently." He was 12. His rule grew more systematic. Every corner of England's religious life came under scrutiny. Sermons were pre-written by the court. Priests were monitored. Parishioners who knelt at the wrong time or murmured the wrong words were fined. Or worse, public worship became scripted obedience. Edward read the reports personally. He summoned informants to court. He adjusted punishments. He rewarded zeal and punished hesitation. The soft-spoken were suspect. The moderate, disloyal. Every act was judged through the lens of purity. He drafted blacklists of forbidden books, proposed mandatory catechism tests for adults, considered a national register of doctrinal conformity. The machinery of surveillance was growing, not in the shadows, but openly, under the gaze of a teenage king. And then, in 1553, his body began to fail. It started as a cough, then fatigue, then lesions on the skin. His hair thinned, his fingernails blackened, his breath turned sour. He wasted away rapidly. The official diagnosis was tuberculosis, but modern historians point to something more complex. Treatments of the time included mercury and arsenic compounds, poisons by today's standards. In trying to cure the king, his doctors may have killed him. It was a grotesque irony. The boy who had poisoned England with fear was now being poisoned himself. But even as his health failed, his zeal intensified. He knew that if he died, Mary would inherit the throne, and with her, the Catholic Church would return. That, to Edward, was worse than death. It was betrayal of everything he had built. So, he acted. He summoned John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, and hatched a desperate plan. Mary and Elizabeth would both be bypassed. His Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey, would take the throne. Jane, intelligent and devout, would be married into the Dudley family. England's future would remain Protestant. But this wasn't just a succession change. It was a purge in waiting. Edward's deathbed orders included lists of nobles to arrest, lands to confiscate, priests to silence. It was a plan not of reform, but conquest. He dictated sermons to be read after his death, sermons warning of Catholic infiltration, demanding loyalty to the Protestant state, instructing informants to remain active. He drafted laws that were never enacted, called for loyalty oaths, for execution powers to pass to local bishops, for new courts to try religious offenses in every shire. He didn't just want Jane to succeed him, he wanted England remade completely, before his corpse had cooled. And still, he suffered. Witnesses described his last weeks in detail. His body emitted a foul odor. His breath grew labored. His skin turned green. Sores opened and would not heal. His hair fell out in handfuls. His voice, once clear and commanding, became a whisper. He hallucinated angels, delivered rambling sermons from his bed, quoted scripture while screaming through the night. He lost control of his limbs, could barely sit upright. But he still issued orders. In one of his final dictations, he implored his council to complete the purification. He did not ask for comfort. He did not beg for peace. He prayed for vengeance. And then, on July 6, 1553, Edward VI died, 15 years old, King of England for 6 years. His final act, an unfinished blueprint for a Protestant theocracy ruled by fear. In his absence, the plan unraveled almost instantly. Lady Jane Grey ruled for just 9 days. Mary raised an army and swept into London. Protestants deserted Jane, afraid of civil war. Dudley's support collapsed. Jane was imprisoned, Mary was crowned, and Edward's dream ended in silence. Yet the silence was not relief. Mary, shaped by years of religious trauma, brought her own fire. She restored Catholic Mass, reinstated papal authority, revived the heresy acts. Protestants were burned. Churches were purified. Dissenters were hunted. But Mary justified her violence with a simple argument. This is what they did to us. Edward had shown her what Protestant tyranny looked like. She simply reversed it. His legacy was not just a failed reform. It was a template for ideological rule. Even Elizabeth, when she later took the throne, governed with caution. Her settlement sought outward uniformity, but left inward faith alone. She remembered Edward's surveillance, the terror it sowed. She knew that to rule in peace, she would need to leave belief unspoken. Edward's impact didn't fade. It redirected. For centuries, historians painted him kindly, a sickly boy, a scholar king, a victim of powerful men. But the documents remained. Journals written in his own hand, orders bearing his seal, draft laws, sermons, punishment logs, execution notes, blueprints for a state-run religious regime. This wasn't the work of a manipulated child. It was the vision of a believer. Edward wasn't controlled. He was convinced. He thought faith needed enforcement. that purity required violence, that God demanded order, and that he, Edward, had been chosen to deliver it. His cruelty wasn't arbitrary, it was calculated, intellectual, precise. He believed that pain had meaning, that opposition was sin, that mercy endangered souls. In short, he was a tyrant with clean hands and a clear conscience, and that made him far more dangerous than his father. Because Henry VIII killed for power, Edward killed for God. His short reign left wounds that shaped English politics for generations. It proved that even a child could weaponize ideology, that tyranny didn't need rage, only certainty, and that religious purity, once given a throne, will always demand a fire. He didn't fall from grace. He was never given any. He was raised to believe. And so he did, until his body failed him, and England was left to reckon with what it had created. Edward VI did not merely die young, he died unfinished, unfulfilled, his reformation incomplete. But the fear he spread outlived him. The caution, the silence, the careful moderation that came after. He remains a warning. That when belief is taught without compassion, when obedience is taught without conscience, when power is given without resistance, what emerges is not holiness, it is horror.